They call it a school, but for many black and brown children in America, it feels more like a prison in disguise. From the moment they walk through the doors, they are met not with guidance counselors or mentors, but with metal detectors, armed officers, and strict policies that punish rather than protect. The chalkboard is replaced with booking forms, the desk with a holding cell, and instead of nurturing minds, the system is designed to push vulnerable students down a pipeline, one that leads straight from the classroom to the prison yard. In America, we chase dreams using the domination system, which in short is, if you work your butt off, you'll get what you want, and you can and will achieve. But the problem with the American dream concerning the rewarding part is, not everyone achieves it. The people responsible are the powers, such as big business, politicians, aristocrats, and private prisons. This is the domination system. These powers use zero tolerance to enforce the domination system. Zero tolerance is said to help, but really just enforces the school-to-prison pipeline. In today's video, we're exposing the harsh reality behind what's been called the school-to-prison pipeline, a deeply rooted structure that criminalizes black youth and mirrors the same mechanisms that once fueled slavery and segregation. This isn't just a failure of education, it's a modern form of social control, a new face of an old system. So before we dive right in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support this channel as we continue uncovering the truths that history tried to bury. Now let us go down this snake road to see what it shows us. In the United States, there is the belief that a quality education and education as a whole is a child's ticket to a prosperous and successful life. It was Thomas Jefferson who went as far as to say that it is incredibly important to educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Jefferson's belief about the United States was meant to extend into the future, but this moral value and commitment was never extended to low-income communities, and especially communities of color, almost as if the privilege of an education is only reserved for some people, not all. All across the country, black and brown youth especially, have been abandoned and disappointed by the education system. A system meant to give them mobility is instead forcing the black and brown youth of this country to remain in their subservient positions. One of the most successful forces hindering the progress of black and brown youth is the school-to-prison pipeline. The school-to-prison pipeline can be summed up by a series of events in a child's education that takes the child out of school and puts it into the United States incarceration system. The school-to-prison pipeline eats black and Latino youth just to spit them back out. The presence of the school-to-prison pipeline places a dark shadow over America's educational system and is ruining student potential in black and brown communities. The school-to-prison pipeline and its relationship with punitive actions are directly responsible for the criminalization of black and Latino youth and their lack of success in the United States educational system. The school-to-prison pipeline, also known as the school-to-prison link, school-prison nexus, or schoolhouse-to-jailhouse track, is a systemic process where marginalized students are pushed out of mainstream education and into the criminal justice system. This occurs due to exclusionary discipline policies, lack of emotional support, exposure to violence, and so many other reasons. The American educational system has huge cracks, and over 1 million students fall through them each year. In 2007, only 68.8% of all public school students in the nation graduated from high school. The dropout burden is not shared equally by all. Urban high schools are facing an extraordinarily concentrated dropout crisis. The unemployment rate for African American male high school dropouts is surpassing 60%, an exceptionally dire consequence both socially and economically. Race and class define the STPP, and it has disproportionate effects on students in high minority and high poverty schools. Sometimes, even when students do not wish to drop out, they are forced out by desperate school administrators concerned about state standardized testing. Minority children are disproportionately affected by the STPP's general and zero-tolerance discipline policies. For example, in 2003, African American youths made up 16% of the nation's overall juvenile population, but accounted for 45% of juvenile arrests. This phenomenon cannot be explained by an increase in unacceptable conduct by minority children. Reports indicate that African American students are more likely than their white peers to be suspended, expelled, or arrested for the same kind of conduct at school. Racial disparity continues throughout the juvenile justice system. Race plays a role beyond the punishment of our youth and is described this way because just as youth of color are disproportionately suspended and expelled, the consequences are not race neutral either. It is estimated that only 10% of young white high school dropouts are incarcerated by their early 30s, compared to 52% of African American male high school dropouts. In 2004, African American youth represented 16% of the population, 28% of juveniles arrested, 32% of juveniles convicted of a crime, 36% of youth incarcerated in a juvenile detention center, and 58% of juveniles placed in adult prisons. Suspensions and expulsions initiate the school-to-prison pipeline process and are connected to dropout rates and adult incarceration because they result in a referral to the juvenile justice system. The National Center for Educational Statistics reported a 31% dropout rate for students who had been suspended 3 or more times before the spring of their sophomore year, as compared to the 6% dropout rate for students who had never been suspended. Any involvement with the juvenile justice system can be powerfully damaging to an adolescent. A recent study indicated a first-time arrest during high school nearly doubles the odds of high school dropout, while a court appearance nearly quadruples the odds. Once an individual becomes a high school dropout, that individual is 3 to 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than a high school graduate. A 2006 study addressed the STPP's human impact on the African American community, stating that the incarceration rate of young black males, particularly high school dropouts, has reached levels that jeopardize the achievement of broader social justice goals. Often, prisoners return to communities with 3 strikes against them regarding their employment prospects and with the post-traumatic effects of their treatment inside the prisons. Consider the impact on the African American community in Chicago, where nearly 80% of working-age African American men had criminal records in 2002. Now, this is the deliberate aim of the American system, not an accident. The school-to-prison pipeline refers to the framework of the United States school system that, by design, pushes students out of public schools through suspension or expulsion and into a juvenile detention facility or prison. The popularity of this practice recently exploded as a result of zero-tolerance policies, high-stakes testing, and state laws tying school funding to property taxes. Unfortunately, the students most affected by the school-to-prison pipeline, or STPP, are the students in need of the most help, including students living in low-income or homeless conditions, minority students, students learning the English language, and students with disabilities. 2 conditions create the basis for the school-to-prison pipeline. 1, punishment-based disciplinary policies, combined with 2, economically limited public schools struggling to provide at-risk children with an education. This combination drastically increases the likelihood that these children will end up with a criminal record rather than a high school diploma. From the plantation to the prison yard, America has always found ways to keep black bodies under control. Today, the so-called school-to-prison pipeline funnels our children from classrooms to cages. It's not accidental, rather it's systemic, a design to criminalize black youth early, push them out of education, and feed them into incarceration. Going forward, here are 10 ways the pipeline works as modern-day enslavement. 1, underfunded schools create desperation. Black and brown schools are chronically underfunded, with outdated books, crumbling buildings, and overcrowded classrooms. Instead of opportunity, kids get neglected. The system is designed to set them up for failure from the start. For most students, the pipeline begins with inadequate resources in public schools, overcrowded classrooms, a lack of qualified teachers, and insufficient funding for extras such as counselors, special education services, and even textbooks lock students into second-rate educational environments. This failure to meet educational needs increases disengagement and dropouts, increasing the risk of later court involvement. Even worse, schools may actually encourage dropouts in response to pressures from test-based accountability regimes such as the No Child Left Behind Act, which create incentives to push out low-performing students to boost overall test scores. 2. Zero-tolerance policies push kids out. Another basic component is the enforcement of zero-tolerance policies that permit the use of extreme disciplinary measures that may lead to the removal of students from the classroom. Harsh zero-tolerance policies mean suspensions and expulsions for small infractions. Black children are punished more harshly and more often than white students for the same behavior. This pushes them out of classrooms and into the streets. Zero-tolerance policies were first implemented during the 1980s and later soared after the Columbine High School shootings in 1999, which resulted in the death of 12 students. Since then, gun violence in public schools has continued to be an issue Americans face today. In states like Texas, there has been an increase in the enforcement of zero-tolerance policies since the recent school shooting in Uvalde. And it is obvious that a push for removing students who pose a threat to the school environment is spearheading this problem. Most schools that enforce these policies argue that zero-tolerance measures promote a structured, disciplined learning environment and help shape responsible individuals who understand the consequences of their actions. However, a growing body of research suggests otherwise, indicating that these harsh disciplinary practices often push students out of the education system and funnel them directly into the criminal justice system, fueling what is now widely known as the school-to-prison pipeline. Aside from zero-tolerance policies contributing to students' entry into the criminal justice system, further research on the school-to-prison pipeline, STPP, has revealed that students of color are disproportionately affected. They often face additional hostility in the classroom, including microaggressions from school staff and administrators, which further alienates them and reinforces the systemic push out of the education system and into the penal system. Although zero-tolerance policies lead to more punitive punishments for all students, the severity of punishments is applied differently across ethnicities, often contributing to the criminalization of youth. In particular, school administrators will barely discipline white students for objective behaviors such as vandalism, smoking, and violence. On the contrary, Black students are subject to discipline for trivial matters like being disruptive or disrespectful or acting threatening. Also, when schools lack resources, face incentives to push out low-performing students, and respond to a handful of highly publicized school shootings, such schools are said to have embraced zero-tolerance policies that automatically impose severe punishment regardless of the circumstance. Under these policies, students have been expelled for bringing nail clippers or scissors to school. The rate of suspension has increased drastically in recent years, from around 1.7 million in 1974 to 3.1 million in the year 2000, and it has been more extreme for children of color. Overly harsh disciplinary policies often propel students into the school-to-prison pipeline by increasing their chances of entering the juvenile justice system. When children are suspended or expelled, they are frequently left unsupervised and without access to meaningful, structured activities. This isolation causes many to fall behind academically, which can lead to disengagement from school altogether and ultimately result in higher dropout rates. These conditions significantly heighten the risk of court involvement and long-term entanglement with the justice system. As harsh penalties for minor misbehavior become more widespread, many schools are increasingly ignoring or bypassing due process protections for suspensions and expulsions. This is more prevalent for students with disabilities, who are disproportionately funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline, despite being legally entitled to additional safeguards under federal law. 3, criminalization and racialization of Black boys and girls. Black students are pushed out of school, arrested, and funneled into the justice system at alarmingly disproportionate rates, despite research confirming that Black students do not misbehave at higher rates than their white peers. School discipline increasingly mirrors the criminal justice system, especially for students of color. What was once considered normal childhood behavior, talking back, dress code violations, or classroom disruptions, is now often met with law enforcement involvement, suspensions, and even arrests. Black and brown students are disproportionately labeled as threatening or aggressive for the same behaviors that are overlooked or lightly disciplined in white students. This isn't coincidental. This is rooted in deep-seated racial biases that frame students of color, particularly black boys and girls, as inherently dangerous or defiant. The result is a pattern where misbehavior is not simply punished, it's criminalized, where minor infractions of juveniles escalate into formal criminal records, pushing students out of the classroom and into courtrooms. Although black students represented only 15% of the national student population during the 2015 to 2016 school years, 31% of them were arrested or referred to law enforcement. This is not surprising, considering that police officers have been found to misperceive black boys as older and view them as less childlike and less innocent than white boys of the same age suspected of committing the same crimes. The experience for black girls in schools is even worse. When compared to white girl students during the 2015 to 16 school years, black girls were 4 times more likely to be arrested, 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement, and 2 times more likely to be physically restrained. During the 2017 to 2018 school year, school-related arrests increased by 5% nationally, and referrals to law enforcement increased by 12% nationally. Black children account for 15% of the total enrollment of K to 12 public schools, yet make up 38.8% of expulsions with educational services and 33.3% of expulsions without educational services. Similarly, students with disabilities represent 16% of the total enrollment of K to 12 public schools, but make up nearly 30% of school arrests. Black students receiving services represent 2.3% of the student body, but account for 9.1% of student arrests. Both students of color and students with disabilities are being over-disciplined and discriminated against across the country. The combination of race and disability compounds these effects. For example, JW, a black high school student with emotional and intellectual disabilities, was unable to access the space that he used to calm down at school. Unable to find a safe space to escape from his bullies, JW attempted to leave campus by walking home. The school responded by blocking JW from exiting and calling the school police officer, who tased and handcuffed JW. Since this incident, JW has missed several months of school while experiencing intense anxiety and PTSD. How sadder can it get? The Fifth Circuit made a dangerous ruling when they decided that the tasing of JW was an act of school discipline that couldn't be challenged under the Fourth Amendment. This ruling opened the door to the use of harsh discipline and excessive force on students with disabilities, effectively stripping them of a safe school environment. Without reform of the current educational system, students with disabilities, especially indigent black students, will continue to be funneled through the school-to-prison pipeline in violation of their civil rights. 4. Over-policing in schools. School policing is inextricably linked to this country's long history of oppressing and criminalizing black and brown people, and represents a belief that people of color need to be controlled and intimidated. Historically, school police have acted as agents of the state to suppress student organizing and movement building and to maintain the status quo. Local, state, and federal government agencies designed to protect dominant white power institutions made the intentional decision to police schools in order to exercise control of growing power in black and brown social movements. In this, the police have been remarkably successful. Despite the over 60 years that have passed since schools were integrated, black and brown students are denied the opportunity to fully participate in and benefit from public education. Nowadays, in many public schools across the United States, the silent corridors meant for learning have been gradually transformed into zones of surveillance and control. Many schools now have more police officers than counselors. Minor misbehavior becomes criminalized, leading to arrest for what used to mean a trip to the principal's office. It conditions kids to see cops before they see teachers. An increasing number of school districts now employ police officers to patrol hallways, often with little or no specialized training in working with youth. As a result, students are more frequently subjected to school-based arrests, most of which are for nonviolent infractions like disruptive behavior. This marks a significant and troubling shift, as such criminalization of typical student conduct would only further destabilize and traumatize the young generations. The presence of sworn law enforcement officers, commonly called school resource officers or SROS, in the hallways is now a familiar sight. But what begins as a measure framed around safety often becomes a gateway into the criminal justice system for students, especially those of color. For instance, the American Civil Liberties Union gave a recent report where many under-resourced schools make police the default disciplinarians rather than educators or administrators. The result? Children in these schools are much more likely to face school-based arrests even for nonviolent or minor infractions. The introduction of police to school districts serving Black and Latino students set the stage for today's school policing infrastructure. Law enforcement was embedded in schools beginning as early as the 1940s. Indianapolis Public Schools hired a special investigator to serve the school district from 1939 to 1952, when the position was renamed Supervisor of Special Watchmen. In 1970, the Watchmen would become the Indianapolis Public School Police. Similarly, the Los Angeles School Police Department traces its origins to 1948, when a security unit was created to patrol schools under the pretense of protecting school property after integration. For more information on the history of school policing, read We Came to Learn, a call for police-free schools. Typically, schools that employ zero-tolerance policies also have an increased presence of law enforcement and security surveillance. For example, one high school in Philadelphia, named Strawberry Mansion, reported having 94 security cameras throughout the campus. And students are welcomed each morning by security guards and metal detectors as they walk through the school doors to start their day of learning. One study showed that from 2015 to 2016, approximately 2.7 million students in K-12 grades had received one or more out-of-school suspensions during that school year. In a similar study, in 2018 to 2019, it was discovered that although African American students made up less than 15% of the overall Texas student population, they accounted for 32% of out-of-school suspensions. In comparison, students made up for 27% of the Texas student population, yet accounted for 14% of out-of-school suspensions. Moreover, according to the 2024 Texas Education Agency report, there were a total of 6,049 expulsions in Texas alone as at 2022. Although 90% of the reasons for suspensions and expulsions were indicated to be due to violations of a school code of conduct. The statistics depict an unfortunate reality that African American and Hispanic/Latinx students are disproportionately affected by such sanctions. Going forward, a deeper analysis by the Brookings Institution revealed that while school resource officers, also known as SROs, may reduce certain types of school violence, their presence is also associated with significantly higher rates of student discipline. In a quasi-experimental study, it was discovered that the introduction of an SRO led to approximately 12 additional suspensions, which is about a 62% increase, and one more expulsion, marking a 90% rise per every 500 students. Alarmingly, the presence of SROs also resulted in at least one additional student referral to law enforcement for every 500 students each year. This pattern matters because hallway policing feeds directly into disproportionate outcomes. Schools with high numbers of SROs are more likely to refer minor behavior to law enforcement, and in such scenarios, students of color are hit the hardest. For example, in schools with predominantly Black and Latino enrollment, the arrest rate can be nearly 5 times that of schools without such officers. 5 disciplinary alternative schools. These institutions are often portrayed as second-chance environments for students who struggle in conventional classrooms. However, in practice, these institutions frequently become a critical juncture within the school-to-prison pipeline, particularly affecting historically marginalized youth. Rather than serving as rehabilitative spaces, many students redirected to disciplinary alternative schools find themselves placed in separate settings with limited academic resources and reduced oversight. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, some of these schools, especially privately run ones, operate outside of standard educational accountability, minimal classroom hours, weak curricula, and scarce support services. This separation doesn't just interrupt a student's educational journey, it increases the likelihood of disengagement, dropout, and entry into the juvenile justice system. The loss of continuous academic instruction, combined with stigma and low expectations, places students at a disadvantage. Moreover, a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that higher rates of exclusionary discipline, including placement in alternative schools, correlate with long-term increases in adult arrest and incarceration. Myriad data show that the chances of later arrest for students assigned to schools with elevated suspension or alternative schooling rates is around 15 to 20%. For vulnerable students, particularly those from low-income families or students of color, the disciplinary alternative schools often become the cooled-out segment of the system, removed from the mainstream, isolated, and deprived of the support they need most. In this way, disciplinary alternative schools serve less as safe havens and more as waypoints along a path away from opportunity and into justice system involvement. 6. Court involvement and juvenile detention. One of the most alarming outcomes of the school-to-prison pipeline is how swiftly disciplinary issues in schools can escalate into full-blown legal entanglements, especially for marginalized students. When schools involve law enforcement in response to student misbehavior, often for nonviolent infractions such as insubordination, dress code violations, or minor disruptions, students are funneled from the classroom into the courtroom. This early court involvement places youth, particularly students of color, and those with disabilities, directly in the grip of the juvenile justice system, and immediately, what began as a minor school discipline issue can quickly spiral into probation, juvenile detention, and for some, permanent criminal records. Once detained, many youth are exposed to environments that are more punitive than rehabilitative, with limited access to education or counseling. In most cases, youth who enter the juvenile justice system are denied basic procedural protections. In some states, as many as 80% of court-involved children lack legal representation. Even students charged with minor infractions can end up in secure detention facilities for violating broad probation conditions like skipping school or failing to follow teacher instructions. Those pushed into this system often land in juvenile detention centers that offer little to no access to meaningful education. Students of color, along with those with disabilities, are disproportionately impacted, frequently suspended, expelled, or arrested for behaviors that would receive lesser consequences if committed by their white peers. Unfortunately, while the path from school to incarceration is well-worn, the way back is far more difficult. Youth who become entangled in the justice system face significant obstacles when attempting to return to traditional schools. As a result, a large number of them never earn a high school diploma, reinforcing cycles of marginalization and limiting their future opportunities. 7. Tracking into low-wage futures. When it comes to readying students for the jobs of the future, America's K-12 education system too often does not sufficiently prepare Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. Research has shown that when students' socioeconomic backgrounds and test scores are similar, racialized tracking is still evident. Instead of preparing Black students for college, many schools track them into low-skill, low-wage vocational paths. This keeps generations stuck in cycles of poverty, while white students are tracked toward leadership. Teachers' bias has also been found to be one major factor behind rating Black students lower than white students on achievement and ability, even when prior achievement is accounted for, which contributes to biased recommendations for track placement. These tracking practices reinforce existing inequalities, with Black, Latinx, and low-income students tending to be concentrated in lower tracks. This negatively affects these students' life outcomes, specifically in terms of their long-term career prospects and economic security. For example, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are currently underrepresented in high-wage jobs, but overrepresented in low-wage work and among the unemployed. This is particularly significant because unemployment for low-wage workers, who are overrepresented as service industry essential workers, has soared since the coronavirus pandemic. 8. Private prisons profit from Black youth. For-profit prisons literally make money off incarceration. Studies have found that private prisons house a higher proportion of people of color compared to public facilities. This aligns with broader trends in the U.S. criminal justice system, where Black Americans are incarcerated at significantly higher rates than their white peers. The simple truth remains that there is a price paid for each and every single convict filed into a private prison. Deciding the steady influx of these convicts and what kind of people these convicts ought to be isn't actually far from the survey, is it? That means every black child funneled into the pipeline becomes a dollar sign for corporations. It's slavery rebranded, with a balance sheet instead of an auction block. The concept of racial disparities behind bars is not exactly a new one. Years ago, a study by an UC Berkeley graduate student surprised a number of experts in the criminology field. Its main finding: private prisons are packed with young people of color. The Sentencing Project estimates that 1 in 3 black men will spend time behind bars during their lifetime, compared to 1 in 6 Latino men and 1 in 17 white men. Black men spend an average of 20% longer behind bars in federal prisons than their white peers do for the same crimes. These reports and thousands of others have the cumulative effect of portraying a criminal justice system that disproportionately incarcerates black Americans and people of color in general. 9 from juvenile detention to adult prison. Once a child is pushed out of school and into juvenile detention, the pipeline accelerates. Juvenile records often follow them into adulthood, making it harder to get jobs, housing, or a fresh start. It's a revolving door by design. The Alliance for Educational Justice has documented 106 cases of school police officers physically harming students of color by using unnecessary force when responding to typical schoolyard behavior. To compound matters, the current landscape of school discipline extends beyond suspensions to include a variety of practices to prevent and punish delinquent behaviors. Students, especially students of color, regularly interact with metal detectors, school resource officers, handcuffs, sweeps, and drug-sniffing dogs as part of their school day. The presence of police in schools also conditions students of color to accept the constant presence of police as a part of their everyday existence. There is no evidence to demonstrate that increasing law enforcement, surveillance, and guns in schools makes students safer. Conversely, the increased presence of police officers in schools has been linked to increases in school-based arrests for minor behaviors and negative impacts on school climate. Thus, rather than make schools safer, the presence of law enforcement in schools places students of color at risk of criminalization for age-appropriate schoolyard behavior. 10 school closures and charter takeovers. School closures and charter takeovers are policy interventions, often triggered by low student performance, where a traditional public school is shut down and its students are moved to other schools, or a charter school takes over the existing building and management. While proponents argue these actions provide new options for students in underperforming schools, these policies are often controversial due to the negative impacts they can have on students, communities, and school staff. Public schools in black neighborhoods are often shut down and replaced with charter schools that expel or push out students who need the most support. This displaces children and destabilizes entire communities in most cases. A 2016 study from the Center for Civil Rights Remedies found that at 500 charters across the nation, suspension rates in 2011 to 2012 for black students were at least 10% higher than for their white peers. At 374 charter schools studied, more than 25% of their students were suspended at least once in the 2011 to 2012 school years. It should be said that the study also identified low suspending charter schools compared to their traditional public school counterparts. But in general, although the charter system often paints itself as a better option for black parents, in general, it has not acknowledged the harm that rigid disciplinary policies have imposed on black students. But the question remains, in an era where technology leads social conversation, how existent is this social problem today? Although much of what is happening within the walls of the education system today is put under a microscope of scrutiny due to camera recordings and social media forums, we continue to see the subtle reinvention of this pipeline through modern-day policies and procedures. Instead of striving for gun reform, legislators are finding it most effective to just completely rid schools of any at-risk students that could pose any disruptive or aggressive behavior. While zero-tolerance policies were initially intended as protective measures primarily aimed at gun violence, they have since expanded to be used for a wide range of behaviors, many of which are subjective. Currently, One bill that has been introduced, SB 245, relates to the discipline management of students. This bill proposes that teachers should have the liberty to remove a student from class who is interfering with the teacher's ability to communicate actively with students, or whose behavior the teacher determines to be unruly, disruptive, or abusive without first allowing the student to receive behavioral support, and may be immediately subject to the possibility of being placed in an alternative education setting or being expelled. The conversation on whether such sanctions continue to be enforced is not the only one to be discussed. In most instances, this social issue is a result of a lack of adequate resources within the public education system in America. Classrooms are overcrowded due to a disproportionate student-to-staff ratio, unqualified teachers, limited funding for extracurricular activities, and limited adequate resources such as school counselors and social workers. What makes the school-to-prison phenomenon so complex is that it carries the challenges of two complex institutions that find their way to each other through deep embedded social issues. Unfortunately, school budgets limit the ability to rethink disciplinary measures within the education system. However, some districts are leading in their efforts to dismantle this pipeline. For example, districts are beginning to implement their own school code of conduct that minimizes school suspensions and allows students to proactively learn from their mistakes through other measures. Other districts recognize that removing students from the classroom is a short-term solution, as the student will eventually return, and instead have signed memorandums of understanding with their local law enforcement to help keep minors out of criminal courts. Schools in Colorado have also challenged this phenomenon by passing a law in 2013 restricting suspensions and expulsions. Since the passing of this law, there has been about a 25% decrease in suspensions reported, and school attendance has increased by 30%. By reducing school exclusions, the risk of criminal involvement is decreased by the mere fact that young people are in attendance at educational establishments, therefore lowering their risk of entering the youth justice system through lack of basic regular supervision. Many alternative provision, or AP, settings and forward-thinking school districts have successfully reduced student exclusions by investing in staff training focused on restorative practices. These approaches prioritize relationship building, de-escalation, and open dialogue, helping to maintain student engagement. By equipping educators to navigate culturally diverse classrooms and encouraging empathy, accountability, and mutual respect, schools create more inclusive environments that address behavioral issues without pushing students out of the educational system. Recently, the Texas Center for Justice and Equity released a guide strategizing on recommendations implementing restorative practices through 4 progressive recommendations. Although these may not eliminate the systemic problems that have accumulated over decades in the education system, it is a strive for a more conducive learning environment and ultimately a better future for the youth. Moreover, many AP students have experienced trauma, abuse, or gang violence. With these restorative approaches, staff can help students process trauma, build empathy, and develop conflict resolution skills, giving them the emotional regulation they need, helping prevent violence, and resulting in fewer arrests and incarceration risks. Encouraging this positive staff-student relationship can only prevent disengagement and criminalization. AP settings that prioritize relational learning create safer spaces, reducing the likelihood of students joining gangs or engaging in crime. Fostering trust, emotional safety, and resilience ensures students feel valued and supported. With the traditional zero-tolerance policies disproportionately affecting disadvantaged students, most youngsters feel the need to seek validation through criminal activities. In contrast, the alternative provision, popularly abbreviated as AP, has restored new settings that adopt restorative practices to counteract systemic issues like poverty, racism, and limited access to mental health support. By addressing these root causes and breaking the cycle, such approaches offer a powerful pathway to reducing incarceration rates among marginalized youth. With the UK prison system in England and Wales facing significant challenges, including overcrowding, rising prison populations, and potential capacity issues, with a projected increase in the prison population, Policymakers, educators, and communities must prioritize the young and the disadvantaged through relational learning and restorative justice by fostering trust, resilience, and constructive discipline to keep students in classrooms and not in courtrooms. As we've explored today, the school-to-prison pipeline isn't just a flaw in the education or justice system. It's a reflection of deeply rooted inequalities that continue to target marginalized communities, especially Black and brown youth. From zero-tolerance policies to over-policing in schools, the system is structured in a way that often sets students up for incarceration rather than education. So the question remains, is this just discipline, or is it a modern form of slavery? It's time to challenge these systems. It's time to advocate for restorative practices, inclusive education, and real opportunities for all children regardless of their race, background, or health status. If this video opened your eyes or sparked your thoughts, please give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and subscribe for more content centered on truth, justice, and the Black experience. It's always been helpful having you with us on this journey. Thank you for always watching. See you in our next video.